She holds a PhD in history and has worked in the field of policy development for the last 30 years, including as a senior policy advisor at the Dutch Ministry of Education, Culture and Science, and the National Library of the Netherlands in The Hague. Amongst her areas of expertise are research data management and the certification of digital repositories. Ingrid is co-chair of the Research Data Alliance, RDA, Council. She is also treasurer of the Board of CoreTrustSeal, CTS, and vice chair of the scientific committee of the ISC, World Data System. And Ingrid is project coordinator of the European Horizon 2020 project FAIRsFAIR. Very happy to welcome Ingrid. And as you heard from the brief description, Ingrid really is the best person we could invite to talk about certification of digital repositories. As always, the presentation will be of 45 minutes. And after that, there will be space, another 45 minutes for questions and comments. We invite all the participants to send their questions and comments via the chat, which will be monitored by my colleague Claudia Vilches and myself. And then we will present those questions to Ingrid. Entonces, los invito a enviar sus preguntas, comentarios durante la presentación de Ingrid por el chat. Mi colega Claudia Vilches y yo vamos a monitorear ese chat y vamos a tratar de organizar un poquito esas preguntas para luego presentar esas preguntas a Ingrid. Eso, muy bienvenida Ingrid, very warm welcome Ingrid, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So first, let me see whether I can share my screen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. And you can see my screen?
Yes. And perhaps you can make it in presentation mode. Exactly. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Wouter, for this kind invitation to speak this morning, and good morning to everyone. For me, it's good afternoon because I'm in the Netherlands where it's almost 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm very honored that so many of you show interest in the topic that I'm going to speak about, and especially since we are all in a quite difficult time at the moment because of COVID, and I'm sure that just like me, you are already spending long days behind the screen. So that makes me even more happy to see that you all turn up this morning. I'm talking to you today from my home office in a town in the Netherlands called Alphen aan den Rijn. And the office of the organization that I work for, DANS, is based in The Hague. But at the moment, we are in a partial lockdown, so this is happening from my home office. We have a 90-minute time slot today, and I think that is a lot of time. So I hope that I can keep you all captivated by my talk. And I gave it the title, Fair and Trust, a Perfect Couple. Of course, I'm going to talk to you about repository certification. But what I would like to do is to put it into a kind of bigger context and bring a kind of natural flow from the broader context to the actual topic into it. So what I'll do is the following. First, I'll start with a couple of words about the organization that I come from. Then I'd like to zoom in on data sharing and why that is important. From there, I would like to go to the topic of the quality of data, zoom in on FAIR data, go from FAIR to the concept of trust, and then finally end at the importance of repository certification. So let's start with a couple of words about my institution. I work in an institution that is really in the Netherlands, the National Center of Expertise in the area of research data. And we have a kind of broad mission to enhance scientific quality by facilitating the reuse of research data. DANS was set up in 2005, and we are an institute that has a mother and a father in the Dutch Academy for Arts and Sciences on the one hand, and our National Research Council, NWO, on the other hand. So both of them support and fund our organization. The organization as such started off in 2005, but we go back way longer because we were founded on a couple of much older data archives in the social sciences and humanities. And that is also where our roots are, in the social sciences and humanities. But over time, we have gotten this broader mission and national role. So we also hold data that come from different domains in science. So let's move to the next slide. There we go. DANS offers a couple of core services. On the one hand, we have technical services, like a long-term repository for data, where we keep the data between brackets forever. And that long-term repository is also certified. Next to that, we offer, let's say, a virtual research environment called Dataverse that is really focused on the short and midterm storage of data, so data during research. And finally, we provide a national gateway to scholarly information in the Netherlands. And that is really a metadata portal that holds metadata on all the Dutch publications. And you can see that there is more than 2 million of them, but also metadata on data sets, on researchers in the Netherlands, and on research projects and organizations. And you can see that in our long-term repository, we have at the moment over 150,000 data sets. So we really have hands-on experience in the preservation of data. Next to those technical services, we also are a center of expertise, and that shows in the fact that we do a lot of training and consultancy work. We also participate in many, mainly European projects focused around data. So I think that is enough about where I come from. Let's go to the main meal of this presentation, and let's start with the importance of data sharing. Open science is a word that is used all over the world in science at the moment, and it is a goal that is really being embraced by many funders and policymakers around the globe. And when we talk about open science, we really mean the free exchange of information, not only for the good of science, but also for society at large. And open science is about, of course, the openness and the ease of access to all the products of science, be it data, be it articles, but also other projects like software, notebooks, etc., etc. Open science is also about the different processes in science. For open science, you need transparent research practices. People need to be able to check what you have been doing. You need open access journals, and you also need a way as open as possible to share data. So data sharing really is a vital component of open science. And why is that data sharing so important? Well, first of all, it gives you the opportunity to replicate and validate outcomes of research. And if that is possible, you have a much better chance of making sure that there is enough scientific integrity and transparency. So this is a very important, let's say, internal quality mechanism in conducting science, having those data available to check research outcomes. This is a nice illustration of that. Here you see headlines from the international press from a couple of years ago when we had a case in the Netherlands of severe scientific fraud, where a psychologist in the Netherlands really made up his data and published articles on the basis of those fake data. And that caused a lot of debate, not only within science, but also amongst the general public. And it really harmed the trust that people have in science. So having the data available for replication makes situations like this much more difficult. But there is a wider benefit of data sharing, not only the replication within a certain domain of science, but the wider reuse of data is also very important and beneficial. It creates efficiency in science. It gives the funders a bigger return on their investment in science, but most of all, it makes it possible to stand on the shoulders and on the work that others have done, and to use data in ways that people, the original data creators, didn't think of. And also, it makes it possible to combine data sets from different disciplines and really do new research and new and find new outcomes. So here you have a nice example. I just picked one of combining data sets about air temperatures and the occurrence of heart attacks. So really Earth, you could say Earth sciences and life sciences, where they discovered a correlation between the two. So having those data available and reusable helps in advancing science. So if there are so many good reasons to share data, then you could assume that the illustration you see on the left-hand side of this slide, you know, the scientist in the ivory tower saying the data are mine, that would probably now be a scene from the past. And that the situation would be now more what you see on the right-hand side, that there is a data tree and that all the data that have been generated are free for the picking by anyone who would like to use them. Well, we're not there quite. Here you see, for example, an overview of the problems and concerns that researchers around the world have raised in and this is a survey from last year, where I think around 100 of researchers were interviewed. You can see that they still have a lot of issues around sharing their data with others. And you can see that the biggest ones are around the uncertainty about copyright and licensing, concerns about the misuse by others of their data, concerns about not receiving appropriate credit or acknowledgement for the work that they put into their data by reusers. So you can see that there are a lot of concerns, and one of the biggest concerns really is about trust, and a lot of those arguments that you see here really are about trust. So that element of trust is very important, and that is something to keep in mind as we move on to the next topic. And that next topic I would like to elaborate a bit upon is data quality. Data quality is a complicated thing. So I said trust is an important element in research, and we saw that in the graph just now. If you are a reuser of data that have been generated elsewhere, what you, of course, would like to know is, where do these data come from? How were they collected? And what has happened with them along the way? So the provenance question. These are really problems that reusers struggle with. And of course, these have all to do with quality and provenance, and in the end, with trust. If you take quality, I think there are different dimensions to the quality of data. First of all, there is the element of scientific quality, and I will elaborate on all three of them. Secondly, there is the element of the fitness for use of a data set. And finally, there is what I would like to call the technical quality. So let's have a look at that scientific quality. what you would like is that the data that you reuse are really the result of high quality science based upon principles like honesty and transparency, independence and responsibility. You want the science upon which the data are based to be sound and solid. Now, whose responsibility is that to make sure that scientific quality is in order? Well, first and foremost, I think that is the individual responsibility of the researcher himself or herself. But it goes beyond doubt that also the institutional context in which that researcher is working is also important, because the institution can also set rules and create a culture. Although I must say that scientific culture is also very much formed by the more informal networks that play a role within a research community. So in the end, the quality of the science that's being conducted is a shared responsibility amongst a number of stakeholders. And you can see that the repository is not amongst them, because I think scientific quality is something that repositories can't have any control over. The second element, the second facet of data quality is this element of fitness for use, I think. And that fitness for use means that you can have a data set that is based on excellent science and is excellently described, but if it just doesn't fit, your research question in exactly the right way, then probably it is not so useful for you. So there is always in the decision whether or not to reuse a data set, this question of this element of fitness for use. And then finally, there is what I would like to call the technical data quality. So as a product, you could imagine that data have a quality that results from the process by which that data have been generated. A researcher needs to manage and document the data throughout all the stages of the research. And you can see those stages here on the left-hand side. This is first about the creation of the data, then you will process them and analyze them. And once your research is finished, you imagine that you would like to preserve them and give access to them so that they can be reused. And then the whole circle starts again. And through all of those, through the whole of this cycle, it is very important that the people dealing with the data at that time in the cycle take care of the management and the documentation. And the level in which they do that defines the technical data quality. So from the technical, I forgot to mention one item, and I'm just going to click back because you also see there the FAIR acronym, the FAIR principles. Now, I think that the FAIR principles, talking about data quality, only relate to this element of technical data quality and not to the fitness for use and not to the scientific quality element of data quality. So FAIR is really related to technical data quality, and I will elaborate on that because now we will move over to FAIR data. So the concept of FAIR. The FAIR principles are very high-level generic principles that were formulated in 2014. And that all happened in a workshop that was held only 15 kilometers from where I'm sitting at the moment in my home office in Leiden, at the University of Leiden, in a workshop of the life sciences. And I happened to be at that workshop. And there, a minimum set of community-agreed guiding principles were formulated for the first time. And I imagine that the majority of you have heard of them. The F stands for findability, which means that data should be easy to find by both humans as well as machines based on adequate metadata. The A stands for accessibility, which means that the data should be accessible with well-defined user licenses and access conditions, and data should be as open as possible. The I stands for interoperability, and this means that data sets should be in such a shape that they are ready to be linked with other data sets. And finally, the R stands for reusability, meaning that data should be ready to be reused for future research, for example, in all kinds of computational methods and tools. So these are the high-level FAIR principles. And those principles, like I said, were first designed in 2014, and they were published 2 years later in Nature Scientific Data. And you see here the heading of that publication, the FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data Management and Stewardship. Of course, the fact that these principles are so high level, the implementation of them is not quite, not very straightforward. So what happened after the publication was that people tried to define more concrete metrics under each of those 4 principles. And you see the overview of the metrics, of the criteria really here in this overview. Now, I'm not going to dive into this. But what you do see, and I will get back to that later in my talk, is that they all talk about data and metadata. So there is real focus on the data set when it comes to the FAIR principles. So this overview of metrics already helped a little bit in the on the way to the implementation of those very high level principles, because this gives more guidance. So for example, if you look at findable, it says that your data and metadata need a global, unique and persistent identifier. Well, that is a quite a concrete suggestion, recommendation that people can implement. So right really from the start that the FAIR word popped up, it was quite clear that especially policymakers and funders were very charmed by the idea of those FAIR principles. If you Google FAIR and data and principles, within a split second you get almost 300 million results. And you can see on the screen as well that in Europe, but also worldwide, funders and policymakers really love the FAIR concept. In Europe, the European Commission embraced the FAIR principles and also used them for their guidelines on data management for their funding program in Europe. And they also commissioned more than one report to define how within Europe we can build a research data infrastructure that is fair. So funders and policymakers love it, and I think that also has partially to do with the fact that it is quite straightforward and it sounds really wonderful on that high level of the principles. But what about the researchers? How familiar are they with this FAIR concept, and how do they feel about it? Well, here you see again a graph based on the report that I talked about earlier with figures from last year. And here the researchers around the globe were asked how familiar they were at the moment with the FAIR principles. And you can see that the majority of the researchers had never heard of the FAIR principles yet. And only a small minority says that they are familiar with the FAIR principles. So what we see is quite a gap between, on the one hand, the policy documents of the policymakers and the funders and the reality on the work floor, so to say. And here you can see, and I hope that it is visible for you on your laptop or on your screen, you can see the spread amongst the different domains or disciplines when it comes to that familiarity with the FAIR principles. The green area is the area where people say that they are really familiar with them. And the gray area means that people have never heard of the FAIR principles. And the interesting thing is that within the arts and humanities, the FAIR principles seem to be best known. And in the natural sciences, the situation is quite different. And the life sciences are somewhere in between. But still, you can see that most of them never heard of it. If you then take that around 1/3 of the people who have heard of it, and you ask them whether they already in practice comply with the FAIR principles with respect to their research data management, the answer again is that that is, for the majority, not the case. Only 1/3 of them says that they are more or less compliant with the FAIR principles. And I think this also shows that the FAIR principles are easier said than done. Finally, on the right-hand corner, you see the difference of awareness, and this is a result from a European project, FAIRsFAIR, a result from this year. The awareness among the different roles of people within universities. So you see that the principles are well known, more known amongst the support staff and the leadership of institutions, and less amongst the researchers, for whom in the end they are meant. So, and then about the concept of FAIR, what does it really mean? I think the principles also sometimes cause confusion in the debate amongst people. I think that you cannot say that data are either fair or not fair. I think FAIR is like a dot on the horizon. There are big differences between domains, and you want to be inclusive. So I think it's important to speak about them as, you know, you need to try to be as fair as possible within your research, with your data set, and not say it's either fair or not fair. It's not a black and white situation. And also, sometimes I see that people mix up the concept of open data with this concept of fair data. And I think you can have open data, so data that are available for everyone, that are not fair at all, because they don't have enough metadata, they are not in the right format, they do not have a persistent identifier attached to them, etc. And the other way around is also possible. You can have a perfectly fair data set that is machine readable and interoperable, but maybe there is a very good reason that that data set cannot be open because it contains sensitive information. So the two things are really different, and one doesn't automatically imply the other. And then finally, of course, there is the element of open and free of charge that sometimes also leads to confusion. Sometimes open data are not free of charge. For example, when they are in a functionality in a service that offers added functionality. So it's also, I think, important to be very precise in how we use all of these terms to avoid confusion. For me, I think that FAIR is a wonderful acronym. It has created a lot of buzz, and it has helped in drawing attention of funders and policymakers for the importance of data management. But it is also, to a certain extent, old wine in new bottles. It's all about responsible management of your data. That is what it is in the end about. And that is not something that we started thinking about in 2014, but way back. So it is wonderful that we have the FAIR principles, but it is certainly not something completely new, I think. Then I would like to go back to what I said earlier. When I talked about the 14 or 15 metrics, I said you can see that they really concentrate on data and metadata. So the FAIR principles were initially focused on the data object. They were formulated from a digital object perspective, you could say, with a focus on the characteristics of data and metadata. And what they provide when you assess the fairness is really a snapshot, you could say, of a digital object in isolation of its context. But of course, that context is important because it is also very clear that research data, scientific data, will not become and also not stay fair just by magic. What we need is a whole complex around that data with skilled people, transparent processes, interoperable technologies, and a lot of collaboration in order to build and operate and maintain infrastructures in which those data live. And I will elaborate on that. I think this is a very crucial sentence, because otherwise, if we don't have that whole construct, that whole ecosystem around the data sharing in the end will be a fairy tale. So let me try to explain that a bit further with this example. Here you see some of the metrics, the criteria that I showed before under the FAIR principles. So for example, for the findability principle, it says that the metadata data should be assigned a persistent identifier. And it also says that the data should be registered or indexed in a searchable resource. So all of these metrics, and it goes on, this list, really show dependencies with the data infrastructure in which those digital objects are managed and are preserved. So, I mean, assigning a persistent identifier to your data set is usually something that happens automatically once you deposit your data in a repository. And also when you think about the indexing in searchable resources, that is something that happens within the infrastructure. Same counts, you know, for communication protocols or, for example, a repository that sets retention policies on the data and performs expert data curation. All of those elements are not something that, not elements that are organized within the data set or that are taken care of by the producer of the data. So in the end, what we need is a whole fair data ecosystem concept. And you can see that a little bit on the right-hand side of this slide. You need not only the researcher and the data set, but around that you need policies, you need data management plans, persistent identifiers, certain standards, repositories, and that whole conglomerate of infrastructure and also skilled people working in that infrastructure. They together guarantee that data become and remain fair. So I hope you see that the picture becomes more and more complicated when you think of the starting point of those 4 high-level, simple sentences that I started off with the 4 letters. So now I would like to move from the concept of fair to trust. This is what you see here on the screen is already a quite old report that was published by the European branch of the Research Data Alliance. But I think this sentence is quite critical. It says, perhaps the biggest challenge in sharing data is trust. How do you create a system that is robust enough for scientists to trust that if they share their data won't be lost, garbled, stolen, or misused? So that system that I just talked about, how do we make sure that researchers trust that system and are willing to share their data through that system? That system of that sustainable data infrastructure system that is important is shown by this example. Again, a survey in which it became clear that over a third of the researchers that were surveyed lost data at some point in their career while they were working on the data. And there seemed to be, and that is explainable, a high correlation with the fact that those researchers stored their data on hard drives and probably on sticks, etc., and did not make use of the right infrastructure to store their data for the longer term. So sustainable data infrastructure is very important. But when you are a researcher, and you have done your research and you have a beautiful data set that you think is worthwhile to keep for the long term, where do you go with that data set? You can't keep it in the drawer of your desk. Do you put it on the server of your institution, or do you decide to store it elsewhere? What do you do, and whom should you trust with your data? Now, there is a registry available called the Re3 Data Registry that holds, as you can see here, 2,500 repositories around the world. So you can imagine that that is to find the right repository for your data set is to find the needle in the proverbial haystack. Trust is important. And how do you find the right repository? I want to take a look now at a recent result of the Research Data Alliance. In this organization, there was this community effort to create, next to really complementary to the FAIR principles, a number of high-level principles around the concept of trust for repositories. In the end, that led to a paper again in Nature Scientific Data. And this was really a community exercise, as you can see here, with co-authors from different continents, from different stakeholders, and from multiple domains. And these high-level principles on trust are really there to facilitate stakeholder discussion and to guide repositories. And you can see those trust principles here. So the focus is not the data set, but the repository, and it's about transparency. It's about responsibility, user focus, sustainability, and technology. I don't think we have the time to really dive into this, but to go quickly through them, transparency is really about being transparent about what you can offer your audience. So people who want to store their data and people who want to reuse, and show and also provide publicly accessible evidence about your services and your data holdings. Being responsible for the authenticity and integrity of your holdings. Making sure that you ensure the right norms and ethical norms that are used in your user community. Make sure that you can promise the long-term availability of your data and provide the right infrastructure for secure and persistent and reliable services. So really basic elements to create trust for the users and other stakeholders in your repository. You can find the trust principles here, and for organizations, there's also the possibility to endorse them via the RDA website. Anyone who is interested at the upcoming RDA plenary conference and next month, there will also be parts in the program that are really dedicated to the trust principles. So let's now move on to repository certification, because how can we implement these high-level trust principles, and why should we want to do that? First, about the why. I talked about this huge number of repositories that producers of datasets and reusers could go to, and picking the ones that you think you can trust. Well, of course, I think trust between people is not so different from trust between organizations. So it's important for a digital repository to show to their stakeholders that they adhere to certain values like integrity and transparency and predictability and competence. Now, of course, you can say yourself that you are a trustworthy organization, but very often it's better that others say that about you, that you have an external acknowledgement. Now, when you look at researchers, they usually look at their peers, where they go to store their data. So reputation is a very important element in the decision-making for researchers. But when it comes to funders and publishers, for example, they are really looking for third-party endorsements, and certification can in that area also play a very important role as a kind of third-party endorsement. And one of those certification mechanisms that is really picking up is CoreTrustSeal. CoreTrustSeal is really a community-driven repository certification mechanism. It was developed under the umbrella of the Research Data Alliance, and it is a merger of two already existing certification mechanisms, one from the World Data System, and the other one called the Data Seal of Approval. That was an initiative that was taken a long time ago by DANS, but it was already an international mechanism. So the two were brought together, and the best of both worlds were combined, and that led to this new CoreTrustSeal certification mechanism. And it consists of 16 different requirements that really reflect the characteristics of data repositories who want to be trustworthy. And it is really a core standard. There is also an ISO standard available for repositories, the ISO 16363, but that is much more heavy and complicated. It has over 100 metrics and is really tough work to get that. So I think personally that it is not so appropriate for the scientific data repository world. CoreTrustSeal is based on a self-assessment that is then reviewed by peers. And when your self-assessment is approved, you get the CoreTrustSeal for 3 years, and then you need to renew because organizations develop, but also the context in which organizations perform their work develops, of course. And all processes are really transparent. For example, all the self-assessments and the reviews of the organizations that receive the seal are publicly available. CoreTrustSeal has a global uptake and is discipline agnostic, so it is not attached to one or two disciplines. So what does it bring for the different stakeholders? When you are a producer of data, it gives you the assurance that your data are preserved by an organization that really takes care of them and makes sure that they remain usable in the future and fair. For funding bodies, it is also providing confidence that the investment that they have done in the data set is maximized and will remain. For the reusers of the data, it gives them, a kind of benchmark to make sure that the data, that if they use the data from that repository, they are trustworthy. And it also supports the repositories themselves to improve their processes. So the 16 requirements look at different aspects of a repository. A set of requirements deals with the organizational, broader infrastructure. So this is about funding, the quality of staff, also about the continuity of the organization. Then there are a number of requirements that really deal specifically with the management of the digital objects. And finally, 2 requirements about technology and security. So it's really a very broad spectrum of elements and facets of the organization are taken into account. Like I said, that certification process is based first on a self-assessment done by the repository itself. You have to come up with written responses to the requirements, provide public evidence to your responses, and also give a certain compliance level to each requirement. That self-assessment is then reviewed by 2 peers independently and under the responsibility of the Board of CoreTrustSeal. And then if all is well, after a few iterations, usually you get your seal. There is an online tool available to do all of that work. There is an administrative fee because the organization needs to run a couple of basic services. So that is €1,000 for 3 years. And like I said, all the successful applications are made publicly available. And that in itself also creates a huge database of applications and of rich information that everyone can use to professionalize the repository organization. So when you look at the benefits, what we see usually is that people say when you look at the external benefits, this whole process and having that seal heightens the confidence that stakeholders have in the repository, and it also increases our visibility. But I think much more important are the internal benefits, because going through a process like this helps you to improve the professionalism of the organizations, to check and improve, workflows, your technical solutions, but also improve the awareness about all of these elements within the organization, because you need people from different parts of the organization to work together to create a self-assessment. And it also ensures transparency, because you will show the world what you're good at, but also the things where you still need to improve. So for me personally, having gone for my own organization through all of this, I find the internal benefits even more important than the external ones. So here you see the uptake up till now of CoreTrustSeal, and you can zoom in on this on the website. And you can see that we now have almost 100 CoreTrustSeal certified repositories, and there are still some repositories also around the world that still carry the older, the predecessors of CoreTrustSeal, and we hope that they will also renew their certification. But the uptake in 2.5 years has been really great of CoreTrustSeal. Now, looking at the current situation in your part of the world, on the one hand, I checked within the re3 data registry. It gives me 32 repositories in your region, but none of these repositories is yet certified. So the map that you see here, the green countries are the countries where the re3 data registry recognizes repositories. The blue countries are still, there are no repositories registered yet. So anyway, I think a lot of potential available there to work on these topics. So I'm nearing the end. What I would like to stress is that a lot of those requirements that CoreTrustSeal has for repositories really indirectly refer to the fairness of the repository holding. So let's go back again to, one of the important elements under the findability principle is that a data set should have a persistent identifier and that it should have adequate metadata. Well, these things will be taken care of automatically once you deposit your data set in a trustworthy digital repository that is certified, because that repository will produce a identifier for you, but it will also check whether the metadata are in order. So it already gives you a kind of baseline fairness if you deposit your data set in a trustworthy digital repository. But of course, the fairness is a matter of many stakeholders. It's also the data generator. So in the end, we will have, if I look at my own repository at DANS, our long-term repository, there are data sets that are more fair than others, simply because the researcher did more work on the data set. But they all have a kind of base level fairness because that is guaranteed by our repository. So there is a clear relationship between the two. having said that, I would like to point out, to say 2 words about the project that I'm coordinating within Europe, which is all about implementing FAIR in the broadest term of the word. This project is a 10 million euro project with 22 partners in Europe. So it will really bring something about. We are now halfway, and we are there to provide practical solutions for the use of the FAIR data principles and to create a FAIR data culture. And for example, one of the things that we have produced in this project is a tool to assess the fairness of data, which is an automated tool that can be used by repositories. So that way, if we bring together those elements, you know, of fairness of data set with the trustworthiness of repositories, that combination really guarantees high quality research data management and high quality data. Here you see a little overview of that project and the results. So here you see also the Fuji tool, the automated FAIR data assessment tool. We also developed another tool, which is called FAIRware, which is really, let's say, a guide for researchers to have a look at the start of their research, to make sure that they take the necessary measures to make their data as fair as possible. All in all, the project, as you can see on the left-hand side, deals with all kinds of aspects. It's about training, about building competence, about FAIR certification, about policies and practice, and also about interoperability and semantics. And we have 63 results already, deliverables that you can find in Zenodo. So anyone who's interested can have a look. And then finally, I would like to point you to the next plenary meeting of the Research Data Alliance, if you are interested in all of these topics. The Research Data Alliance was going to take place really locally, face-to-face in Costa Rica, in your region. Unfortunately, of course, that is not going to happen. It will be a virtual one. But still, there will be a regional flavor added to it. So I think it might be very interesting for you. And as you can see here, I made a copy of the different pathways that have been identified for the plenary. And this says something about the program, which is really, you can see about data management practices, the FAIR agenda, skills, etc. So a lot of the topics that I touched upon will be discussed in that plenary. So for everyone who's interested, please have a look at the website. And then finally, again, the main takeaways that I would like to present to you based on the talk that I've now given are the following. We need to share our data. I hope that plea was clear, because data sharing is really one of the key elements in making open science a reality. The FAIR principles help us to define high quality and transparent research data management practices. And I've shown that although the principles are quite straightforward, because they are so high level, really implementing them is a very difficult task. But you can see that, for example, within the FAIRsFAIR project, there are tools becoming available. And I think that all over the world, good efforts are being made to really define what that implementation in practice means. I also think that we still need to do a lot of awareness raising, because we also see that it's mainly policymakers and funders and not so much the researchers who are picking up on this. And then finally, next to the FAIR principles, we need trust principles and certification mechanisms like CoreTrustSeal for digital repositories, because they help us to create trust in the research data infrastructure. And we need that trust in order to safeguard the accessibility and the accessibility to different things of our FAIR data for the future. So again, it's that combination of FAIR data in a trustworthy data repository as an important element of the overall goal that we share around the globe, the creation of open science. And I think with that, I would like to stop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. That was a great presentation, very clear, and I think this is also something that we read in the chat that people. It was really helpful to people to hear your presentation, because this is a very important issue, as you mentioned, the issue of trust. It's a big issue, it's a big concept, and I think that was really clarifying, and thank you for that. And what I think especially liked is, I mean, trust is a big issue, right? And
Yeah.
so it's a hard thing to solve. It's a huge concept. So what you basically did, and I think that was great about your presentation, is that you basically said, okay, how can we basically cut this trust in smaller parts and solve each of these issues related to trust one by one?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's great. So that's a very pragmatic way to move forward and to say, okay, I mean, the issue of trust can only be solved if we just tackle one by one each of those elements of trust. So I think that was great, and thank you for that. All right, so we have a few questions, many questions actually, from the audience. So Claudia is going to start with the two first questions. Claudia.
Thank you, Ingrid. Interesting presentation. The first one is related to the first scoring mechanism, and the question is: could be the first scoring mechanism be applicable to any kind of repository, or the core trust seals accept or be applicable to hybrid repositories from data set and publication, for example?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And I'm giving maybe a bit of a long answer, but the CoreTrustSeal started off, and its predecessors started off as a certification mechanism for domain-specific repositories. And that means that they presume a very clearly defined designated community. So as a repository, you need to know your clients really well, the assumption is, in order to serve them in the right way. So you need to know about the ethical norms of your community, and you know that their working processes, what kind of metadata do they work with, what kind of formats are used, all of those elements you need to be familiar with in order to adequately answer to those requirements. Now, if you have, let's say, if you are a national library or a library, and you have publications, or you have an institutional library, then that designated community is probably much broader than a very focused domain repository that serves that has archaeology. So the moment that your audience is broader, it's more difficult to really know the norms and the ways of your community. And we have run into issues within the CoreTrustSeal organizations with that. At the moment, we are working on refining or changing the requirements for more generic repositories, be it, publication repositories or also data repositories like, you know, the FAIRsFAIRs of this world, for example, or Mendeley. And we are again making a community process out of that. So we are working with those repositories together to see how we can, what would be the best way to tweak is maybe not the right word, but to design another form of certification specifically for that group. Having said that, I can also tell you that we have repositories that are publication repositories that have received CoreTrustSeal. So it is possible, but especially the element of the designated community is a difficult one to tackle.
Okay, thanks. Another question, is it possible to do the self-assessment and not apply for a core certification? And I will add a little bit more. Can FAIR data assessment be automatic?
The first one, because I think they're quite, oh, there's a car passing by, sorry about that. About doing a self-assessment without certification. Yes, certainly. And I would also encourage every repository to do so. You can use, there is a whole guidance book with the requirements that gives you a lot of explanation of what is meant. So it is always useful for a repository in whatever phase or state that you're in to check where you are, to do a kind of benchmark, also to maybe identify the gaps. And then you can say, you know, I think that this is really a gap that we need to deal with. You start with that. So it gives you a kind of roadmap if you're not ready yet for certification to work on, to use as a kind of program to work on. And what is also important to say is that there is this huge database of self-assessment and reviews available on the CoreTrustSeal website. So you can see for 100 organizations, you can see what they replied. And all of those answers were, of course, successful answers. So that is a huge tool to use if you are struggling with one of the elements, you know, from CoreTrustSeal in your repositories. Say you want to know what did people do with continuity planning? How do you go about that? You can look in that database, look for repositories that are, you know, similar to yours and see how they tackled that problem. So in that sense, there is a lot of self-help to be done without going through that whole formal process of certification. So that is very important. The second point was about FAIR, what was it, FAIR data? Can you help me? Remind me again?
Yep. Can FAIR data assessment be automatic?
Yeah, it can. So there are, as far as I know, there are now 2 tools in a kind of beta situation available. There is a project in Europe called the EOSC Nordic project. They have an automated tool to assess data. And we in the FAIRsFAIR project have also produced a tool like that. It's called Fuji. It was on one of my slides. If the slides are made available, people can see the link. You can go there and find the tool and look also in GitHub about all the, you know, you can get it. Yeah, so that's available.
Okay, many thanks. Wouter, please.
Yes, right. So we will after your presentation, Ingrid, we will share the recording as well as your presentation. So
okay, great.
Yeah. So we'll be available to everybody. All right. Let me see. Yes. So I think in the beginning you showed this image of researcher like. Data is mine, right?
Yeah.
So I think, and this is one of the comments that we received, is that in principle, a lot of researchers are probably very much the idea of sharing data as a principle. However, there are some practical issues which you mentioned that kind of block this, right? The move from theory to practice.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that in an institution when you have this conversation with the researcher? How do you make the switch in the heads of researchers from liking the principle of sharing data towards sharing in practice?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult one. I think it starts with culture, the culture within an institute or within a group of peers working together. I think very often people say that the problems are, people have, very often they think first that there are technological issues and difficulties. For me, everything in the data management world, the biggest issues are usually cultural differences, cultural issues. But you need a complex of things. First of all, you need to make the researchers aware. That's one thing, that this is important. Then you need to persuade them. Now, what do you need to, then there are two ways to persuade them. On the one hand, there is the stick. So, you know, a funder can add to their funding requirements that you need to make the data available. That's a stick. You also see it on publication, that a journal has a data availability policy. That's another stick. But what you would like is a carrot. And what is a good carrot? It is making sure that that researcher gets academic credits for the work that he puts into a data set to make it available for others and also accessible for others, understandable for others. And there, of course, an institution, a university can play a role in making sure that they change their, you know, their way in which they measure the performance of a researcher, not only looking at the outputs in terms of journals, but maybe also counting the work that they do in the preparation of a data set that is made publicly available. And then there is the element, another enabling, more an enabling element that an institution can take care of, that there are, if a researcher wants to share data, that there are also, that the infrastructure to do that is available, so that there is a virtual research environment that they can make use of during their research to share data. And that the university also helps researchers in their search for a long-term repository, and also, you know, tries to make them clear what the added value of that is. So it's a whole complex of elements that are needed, where you also have a whole complex of stakeholders involved. Again, a long, complicating answer, but I think that is the reality that we're faced with.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. Do you recommend, Ingrid, including to include the FAIR principles in institutional policies?
I think that all the bits and pieces help. So if a university and institution has that in their official policy, I'm sure that that will trickle down in an organization, that people start thinking about, and so what do we do with that? So that helps. Again, you know, that is the most difficult thing, of course, of this whole concept, is making, how do you translate those high-level principles then in actions? But of course, it's the same with certification. I always say you need critical things with certification for a repository is that they need to have their management on their side, because certification can be seen as a burdensome process. It's probably not at the top list of the list of management, because it's not sexy. You know, it's just making sure that the back office is in optimal state. So having management supporting things like that is very important. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Claudia.
Okay. You mentioned, Ingrid, different kind of certification standards, the ISO, for example. What are the different among them, and have you documented the gap between DSA and ISO for the ISO standard?
Yeah.
And if there is some agreement between those the institution that generate the standards?
Okay. What I can say about that is that there are at the moment, there are 3 different levels, you could say, of certification. The top level, the top of the bill is the ISO standard. That ISO standard comes from the ISO organization. It is a very formal standard. If you want to go for that certification, it means that you need to put a lot of money on the table. You need to provide a self-assessment with 100 metrics. There is a big book that lays out all the requirements, which to my mind is very difficult to achieve for repositories in our public scientific domain. And once you have done that, you will get an audit commission that visits your institution and really looks over the shoulder of the people working there for a couple of days. And then, you can get certified. So that is really a very formal process. I know of one organization within, as far as I can see, that is working on this, and this is CERN in Switzerland. Next to that, there is a standard that is developed in Germany, which is called Nestor. And that is a standard that has 34 requirements, so a little bit more than CoreTrustSeal, but it is also a community thing, a community effort with self-assessment and peer review. Developed in Germany, and it hasn't had such an uptake. So I think it's only up till now not even 10 repositories that have certified against that certification mechanism. And DANS, my institution, is the only one who did it outside of Germany a couple of years ago. So that is a kind of intermediate level. And then there is the core level, CoreTrustSeal, that I talked about.
Okay, thank you, Ingrid.
And I think I saw you in the chat, sorry, DIN passing by, is that correct? Did I see that correct?
Sorry, could you repeat me?
I saw a chat popping up. Someone said something about DIN. Is that correct or not? Because that is related to Nestor. So Nestor is the organization, and they took this set of requirements and they have a DIN, which is like the German ISO. It is also a DIN standard. That's correct. Yeah. I don't know the number.
It's not useful. It says it's not useful outside Germany.
Well, it is useful outside of Germany. I mean, it's a good set of requirements, but because there is no uptake, the external benefit of showing that seal on your, putting that seal on your organization doesn't have that much value once no one knows what it is. So it's very useful as an internal benefit, to look at that and to work with it, but it doesn't have near the uptake as CoreTrustSeal does. So, and CoreTrustSeal is more basic than the Nestor one also. Yeah.
Another question regarding organizational infrastructure. What aspects should be included in a continuity plan of a repository to ensure the ongoing access to and preservation of its holdings?
Now we really dive into the details. Well, it's not details, but this is really a content question. So I don't know whether I should dive into that completely, but let me say that there are different elements to that continuity thing. There is, of course, the technical element of it, the continuity of your technical services and provisions. And sometimes people forget that there is also the continuity planning of the organization as a whole. So imagine at DANS that at one day our funder says, well, we have these severe cuts coming from government, and we have decided that one of our institutions in our portfolio can't stay, and we just pull the plug out of DANS. What happens with the 150,000+ data sets that we have? So you need to think about that in advance. And that is one of the things that is core in CoreTrustSeal, that you are forced to think about that. And you are also forced to already come up with a solution. So what Dance, for example, has done in this particular case is we have an agreement written on paper, signed by the Academy, saying that they will take over the responsibility of our data holdings, so of our data sets, and that they will find a home for them. So that is a written statement. So that is a completely different aspect from the technological continuity. And within CoreTrustSeal, we take all of these different, angles of such a topic by the head. So you are really forced to think not only about the repository as such, but everything around it, policies and all the stuff, and funding and staffing, and yeah. But anyone who wants to know really the details should have a look at that guidebook that explains all of that.
Okay, thank you. Wouter.
All right. Next. Yes, let's talk a bit about the differences in terms of uptake of the FAIR principles amongst the scientific disciplines.
Yeah. So
in general, I think we can say that in social sciences, the uptake is a bit low. Why is that? And how is the uptake in the more technological area of or scientific disciplines?
Well, like I showed on the slide, the uptake is highest amongst the humanities and lowest among the natural sciences. Personally, I would have imagined that the highest uptake would have been in the life sciences, because that is where the FAIR principles originate. And what I think it has also a lot to do with, let's say, no, I need to say it in a different way. So the FAIR principles, I think there is a big difference between the uptake of the implementation of the F and the A on the one hand, and the I and the R on the other hand. So making your data findable and accessible is relatively easily done. But really making your data interoperable is a much bigger, also technological challenge, also for the infrastructure, because you need infrastructure for that. It's not something that is encapsulated within the data set. So there is a difference. The difference between disciplines, to me, was very surprising. I would have thought that the life sciences would score highest, especially also because within FAIR, of course, the machine readability is a very important aspect. And you would imagine that that would be lower within the humanities than, for example, in the life sciences and the natural sciences. So in all honesty, I don't have an explanation for those outcomes of that survey. I would personally, what I see from my own experience in the social sciences and humanities, where we come from, is that the humanities really lag behind in the implementation of FAIR. This was, of course, a question about, are you aware, of the awareness of the FAIR principles? So that is different from the implementation. And I think when you talk about implementation, probably the life sciences are the furthest, because they are much more used also to working groups. That is even, of course, an issue within humanities still. Mm-hmm. But for some of the figures, I don't have an explanation for that.
Yeah. When we talk about technology, Ingrid, we also talk about being applied in an industrial context and the economical value of data. How do researchers deal with possible commercial reuse of their data?
Ooh, that is a question that is difficult for me to answer in a way, because I work in a social sciences and humanities environment where those public-private partnerships and the reuse of data in the private domain are hardly ever happening. So I do know that researchers struggle with it, when it comes to licensing and all of those issues, and data sharing, of course, is also very often difficult. But I certainly am not an expert because I don't see that enough in my own working environment. So it's difficult for me to give a good answer to that question.
Okay, thank you very much, Claudia.
Okay. Regarding the license, what kind of license do you recommend, and if you recommend CC and what kind of CC?
Well, that is difficult to say. Of course, when there is no element of sensitivity to the data in one way or another, be it personal data, or be it sometimes you are amazed. For example, we have a lot of archaeological data that can also not be completely openly available because you don't want treasure hunters to go to sites. Sometimes you're dealing with endangered species, etc., etc. But let's say we have a data set that has no sensitivity to it. Then the question, of course, is sometimes researchers do want to share their data, but they also still want to publish on the basis of that data. And then sometimes they want, they say, okay, I would like to share it, but I want an embargo period on it to make sure that I'm not scooped by somebody else. So we see that happening. And then we usually say, don't make that longer than 2 years. If that is not the case, you could argue that CC0 is the best, because then machines can also get to your data. But from a viewpoint of attributing credit to the original generator of the data, you would probably go for a CC BY, because then people can use the data openly and freely, but they have to cite the source of the data. That is, of course, also part of scientific integrity anyway. So I think that even if you use a CC0 data set that has been produced by someone else, you need as a researcher to mention your source. But with the CC BY, there is more guarantee that happens. So there is no one answer to this question. I think there are those different, but of course, the ground rules should be as openly as possible.
Yeah. Another question about the process. Could you describe the process to be certificate and how long could be?
Yeah. So what I always say to repositories who think about this is, what you should do first is take the requirements and the explanations, and then make a group of people in your organization who you think are up to speed with the current situation in your repository on those 16 aspects. And you take an afternoon to discuss with one another, are we already in a situation where we have a chance, to get certified? If so, then you can start up the process, and that is quite simple. You go to the website, and there you can show that you're interested, and you will get an entrance into the tool. And then you can work on writing your self-assessment. And then if you are, in the right state, I would say that process takes you somewhere. Of course, it depends on your level of entry, but let's say that process takes you between 3 and 6 months. And then you submit your self-assessment. Then there will be 2 reviewers appointed who will look at your report. And they get, I think, 2 months for that. And then you get an answer. And then typically you see that there are 2 or 3 iterations where the reviewers come back with questions and with comments, where they want more information, or where they feel that your compliance level is not the correct one, etc., etc. And then usually after a couple of iterations, 2 or 3, then you get your seal. So all in all, it takes a while, but it very much depends. If everything is completely in order and you have all processes documented and It's just a matter of filling out, you know, the form in the tool. I mean, then you can be done in 2 weeks, but usually that is not the case.
Okay, thanks. Very clear. Wouter, please.
Okay. Somebody mentioned that it's sometimes a bit confusing seeing that there is this ISO standard 16363, which has a lot of criteria for, I mean, to define whether a repository is trustworthy. And on the other hand, there's also the CoreTrustSeal. And so the question is there any attempt to harmonize these different standards?
Well, in a way, they are harmonized because they are all based on the OAIS, the reference model for repositories. So they all come from the same basis. And if you look at the requirements in ISO, they also are about the organizational aspects, digital object management, technology, and security. So the basis, the framework is the same. But the ISO one is much more detailed and much more demanding. But they, you know, and it's also they build upon each other. So if you have your CoreTrustSeal, you already have set the first step towards the ISO one.
Yep.
They are not contradictory.
Okay.
Put it like that.
Great. You showed the map of the uptake of the CoreTrustSeal. And we all saw that there's currently no repository with CoreTrustSeal in Latin America and the Caribbean.
No.
On the other hand, you also mentioned, for example, the FAIRsFAIR project, which includes European partners. Do you have knowledge of any project where there are partners from Latin America and the Caribbean involved?
No.
I mean, working on FAIR, on CoreTrustSeal, and this kind of issues certification that we've been discussing today.
No. I mean, we have had, in the context of the World Data System, we have had sessions in, where was it? Was it in Rio or in Sao Paulo? Where we had a group of repositories from the region. And we had a workshop, but I don't think anything that didn't lead to any repository getting certified. No.
Yeah, and you have knowledge of I mean, ongoing projects or where there are Latin American or Caribbean partners.
No. But I think it would be great if there are, I don't know who we have amongst the audience, but if there are representatives from repositories who think that this is interesting for them, be assured that the people within the CoreTrustSeal organization are very, very happy to help anyone. Also, you know, if you would like, if there are a couple of interested organizations, you know, to organize a webinar and really dive into what this is, you know, be more focused. That's all possible. We do that very often for other groups of repositories as well around the globe.
Yeah. All right. A quick question on the COVID context. So we are currently in this pandemic. How important is certification in this COVID context?
Well, I don't think that there is a one-on-one relationship. What I do think that COVID has shown the world is that open science and data sharing is very, very important to act quickly to any, you know, unforeseen circumstance that we run into where we think that science has at least part of the answer. And what you see now with COVID is that we continuously balance between, on the one hand, you want data that are of a high scientific quality. And on the other hand, there is the element of timeliness. You want the data available as soon as they are generated, more or less. So finding the right balance between those two is a very big issue. And I think the COVID pandemic has shown that very clearly. On the other hand, we can only act that quickly if we have infrastructure in place to share data around the world. And repositories, like I try to make clear in my presentation, have a crucial role to play in that infrastructure to make that data sharing possible. So in that sense, I think COVID again shows the importance of all of those aspects that together make open science and data sharing a reality.
Okay, thank you. Claudia.
Okay. The last section of questions regarding, well, what characteristic should have a system of governance of a repository to be effective and sustainable?
The governance, well, I think that the governance can have different forms. What we see is that sometimes it's institutional repositories, so repositories that are part of a university. Sometimes you have repositories like mine, you know, that fall under, for example, a research council or an academy. So there are different forms available. What is important is that there is a long-term vision, and that there is a guarantee for a longer-term funding available. So there are more generic characteristics that are all of course focused on sustainability, because sustainability is an important factor again in creating that trust. And there is not one or another, you know, one governance model that is the ideal model for a repository. But it's mainly about making sure that there is sustainability both in governance and a long-term vision.
Okay.
Of that governance. Yeah.
Thank you. And the last question is if there is any relation with the CRIS initiative.
With the what initiative? Sorry, I didn't.
CRIS, C-R-I-S.
The CRIS initiative, as in the
with dance
assessment systems at universities. Is that meant?
Yeah.
I don't think that there is a direct relationship with the repositories there. If I look at my own institution, there is mainly a relationship between the portal that I was talking about, you know, the national aggregation portal of metadata, where we harvest those CRIS systems at universities to get the metadata. I don't see, but that is the situation in the Netherlands. So I don't know how that is in other countries, but that is all that I can say from my perspective on the relationship between CRISIS and repositories.
Okay, thanks.
I probably not the answer the person who asked them wanted, but that's what I can say about that.
It's okay. Thank you so much. Wouter, please.
All right, thank you very much, Ingrid. So here we are at the end of this webinar. Thank you so much again for your time. Thank you so much for your great presentation. I think this was, as I already mentioned, very clarifying to a lot of people. I would say even innovative to many people. So great to see so much interest in your presentation. Thank you so much for your time. Also, big thanks to the team of the Hernán Santa Cruz Library of the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean, United Nations. Also, the ICT team, who as always support us. And well, I hope as you said, I mean, there is currently no project going on with Latin America. We have no certified repositories. So let's hope that this presentation can, yeah, I mean, give some change to that picture, right? So that would be great. And so we invite all people who are interested in this. I mean, we will share your contact details so they can be in touch with you. They can also be in touch with us if they want to see if hopefully we can make a change there. Thank you so much,
Let's
Ingrid.
look at it from the bright side. This is a whole a bunch of opportunities are available. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Great. So thank you all very much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Ingrid. See you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Marlene and Tamara, and all colleagues who've been helping us with setting up this monthly webinar. Next month, we will be back with another webinar by Jean-Claude Bourgerman, well, ex-European Commission. So we invite you to being there also next month. Thank you so much. Have a great day and stay safe. Take care.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.